In this lesson, we'll start to add some of the finishing touches to the overall behavior of our particles. Okay, so at this point now we have the particle emitter that's been set up for this sort of a refueling hose. We've had a chance now to get in and talk about a lot of the different attributes that control our particle emitter, and starting to get into some of these different particle modifiers. Now, at this point, we're ready to really just kind of come in and add a few little finishing touches to this. So we have our particle emitter that is part of this hose. Now, I also would like to have a few particles sort of stream off the back of this aircraft as it's kind of lifting up. So rather than build an entirely new emitter, because I have this emitter pretty well set up and ready to go, what I'll do is just copy this and then use that one again. So at this point, where we have the hose still connected to the ship, what I'll do is take this emitter and copy it by just pressing Ctrl-C on my keyboard. So Ctrl-C, and now press Ctrl-V to paste. Okay, so here's our new emitter. Here's my original one up here. Now let's take this emitter and connect that to the body of this aircraft. So let's come in and find the aircraft body. So let's expand this, and we're going to look for this animation personal VTOL pod. Now let's take our emitter, move this down, and parent it underneath this pod. So now what that should do is, as this pod is lifting off, we should see that emitter sort of going with it. Now right now it's a little bit difficult to see, so let's take this new emitter for the side of the aircraft and sort of move this over. And there we go. So that way it's sitting out here a little bit easier to see. And let's take that new emitter and make a few little modifications to this. So right now this hose pops away. You can sort of see that emitter moving up with the ship and sort of following it along. Now, one of the things that I see here is that this emitter is actually pointing the wrong way, at least for the ship it is. So it's sort of emitting particles out in this direction, which is good for the hose, but the ship, I actually want these to emit out in the other direction. So let's take that emitter and let's rotate this 180 degrees. There we go. Now rewind that, play this back. There we go. Now it's sort of emitting these particles out in the right direction as far as this ship is concerned. Now these ship's particles, I'd like for these to actually last a little bit longer. So I'd like for this to be sort of a vapor trail on this ship as it's lifting up and away. So let's find a point at which this aircraft sort of lifts off and comes to a little bit more of a stop. So let's say maybe around frame 200. So now let's go to the emitter for this aircraft. Let's set the start emission at the same 118. And for the stop emission, I'll set this to stop at frame 200. So now play that back. And now we have this trail of particles that's sort of lifting up off the ship. Alright, very nice. Now these particles, you can see, are still affected by gravity. You can see they have the wind turbulence on them, so they have kind of that irregular look to them, so really, really nice. Let's maybe come in though, and instead of having this really long trail of particles, let's maybe shorten that up a little bit, so that way we really just kind of have this little trail of vapors that's sort of coming out the back and really not look like it's spilling out some kind of a liquid. So let's go back to the emitter. And for this ship's emitter, I'll take the lifetime, or the lifespan of our particles, and make these particles not live quite so long. So maybe I'll knock that down to something like only 10 frames. So that way as the ship lifts off, we just kind of have that little thin little trail of particles that are coming out. Very nice. Now, one thing that I will try to do is maybe come in, and right now it's spilling out in a little bit more of a fine pattern than what I would like. In my case, I'd like to get something that has a little bit more of a dispersion to it, like it's really sort of being forced out the back of this aircraft. So back in this emitter's emitter tab, I'll take that angle horizontal and angle vertical, and let's raise that up a little bit, maybe something like 90 or even 100 degrees, so that way it spreads out in more of an open kind of pattern. There we go, so that sort of forces that out in a little bit more of a kind of a spray pattern. Very nice. Now, one last thing that I'd like to do to finish this up is as this ship sort of takes off and lifts off, if I turn off my manipulator here, you can see that the particles that we have really just sort of suddenly stop as they're coming out of this ship. So as I move forward, you can see that these particles are sort of emitting out just as they should. But then once we hit a certain point, which that is going to be about frame 200, as our particle lifespan or our particle emission starts to come to an end, you can see that our particles just sort of stop. Right, then we get this really harsh, abrupt cutoff. Now what I'd like to do is give something that is a little bit more of a natural kind of subtle tapering off of these particles. So let's come in and make a few adjustments to that. Now one of the things that you'll notice is that if we wanted to animate how many particles are coming out from our emitter, we actually don't have any ability to animate the birth rate. You'll notice we don't have any sort of a keyframe indicator or a keyframe generator on the end of that attribute. But what we can do is animate the visibility. So right now our visibility is set to 100%, which means we can see all of our particles. Now the visibility, as we start to bring this down to a lower number, what that will essentially start to do is make fewer and fewer of our particles visible. So with that visibility down really, really low to like 7%, you can see we only have just a few little particles that are coming out. So what I'm going to do is use this for animation purposes. So I'll bring that visibility all the way up to 100%. Okay, and we'll say that maybe around frame 180 or 190, sort of as it starts to get up here, let's go ahead and keyframe that visibility. So I'll just control click on this little dot right here. And before it gets to frame 200, or right about the point where it gets to frame 200, I'll keyframe that visibility down to 0. And once again, control click. You can see it turns red, which means a keyframe has been added here. And let's see what that does. So now as this aircraft starts to lift off and starts to kind of reach its apex, now we get a little bit more of this kind of subtle tapering off of the particles. I might even take that keyframe and move that back a little bit more, so that way that little subtle dying off of the particles happens a little bit more gradually. All right, excellent. So at this point, now we've pretty much set up all the behavior of our particles. So now the hose starts to break away, the ship lifts off, and by the time it reaches kind of its apex, now that sort of trail of vapors has pretty much dissipated away. Now, the one thing that we have still yet to do is get these particles to render out. And what you'll notice is if I try to use anything like my interactive render region or anything like that, these particles actually will not render at this point. So if I press Alt-R on my keyboard to open up my interactive render region and move that render region down into this area, you can see the particles are definitely there in my viewport, but when it comes to rendering these out, they are not visible. So what we'll do in our next couple of lessons is learn how we can start to apply sort of a gaseous volumetric quality to these particles.